Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. In this video, I'll be going over something not really touched upon by content creators, something that I see actually quite a bit of in forums, Reddit, for example. I've seen quite a few posts regarding this, various different chats and all that, threads, whatever. People are discussing this, and it's been kind of an issue if you want to consider it to be an issue since the Red Skies update, once the MiG-23 was in the game, really. And that is if the MiG-23 and MiG-27 aren't really all that good. And before I even get into it, I want to preface it with this. They are extremely potent planes, but I'll go over why I think that they're not all that good in today's War Thunder, and I think that there's pretty decent reasons for it, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they're bad planes, but rather where they are, at least in terms of War Thunder's evolution. And again, I think that they're really good planes and really capable planes. I get like 2 or 3 minimum kills per match of air RB with the MiG-27, and that's not even the better of the dogfighters. So yeah, anyways, let's get into it. For me, I feel that the MiG-23 and MiG-27 are excellent missile carriers, but quite honestly, and really I'm just gonna say this at the start of the video, War Thunder is not quite at a point yet where I think they're good planes for everybody. So again, I think that they're amazingly capable planes, especially for air-to-air, but for a lot of people, they suck with them, and I'll go over why now. Now, it's funny because many people, from big content creators to regular community members, were worried that these would be overpowered because of what they could provide, namely in the, well, name of speed and advanced tech, at least in large part. And what those people forgot is that this plane is best at an altitude rarely ever reached in normal War Thunder combat. Most planes, and by this plane I mean both the MiG-27 and MiG-23, at least when it comes to air-to-air. Most planes are better at lower altitudes. The F-5E, the American plane that was released at the same time as the MiG-23, is basically just an evolution of the type of fighting that has been more or less always happening in War Thunder. It's just a little bit faster, turns a little bit more tightly, and has missiles. This combination of speed, agility, and decent armament has always worked in War Thunder, especially at top tier, being that the F-5E in large part travels at a similar speed to nearly all enemies that it will face in regular combat altitudes between 500 and 4,000 meters. And when I say this, I mean obviously the Saab, the JA-37C, the MiG-23M, the MiG-27, they all have substantially higher top speeds than the F-5E or similar planes. But when they're near sea level, of course, they're going to outpace the F-5E, but it's not nearly as big of a difference as it might be at 6,000 or 7,000 meters. Now, in a weird way, by having more planes like the MiG-23 or MiG-27 in game, I feel that these MiGs might actually become more relevant, at least when it comes to the average player. Again, I love these planes. They're really good, but most players, or at least a lot of players, aren't really good with them. I feel like it's a plane that you have a lot of people that are really good with and a lot of people that are really bad with. Currently, because War Thunder top tier air battles are almost like a game of rock, paper, scissors, you have at low altitudes, the F-5E's rock fighting the MiG-23's scissors, or the MiG-27. They're really interchangeable. In much the same way, the MiG-23 would be the paper at high altitude, high speed scenarios versus that same F-5E's rock. Ultimately, it relies somewhat on player skill and knowledge as well to take full advantage of their plane strengths and to minimize their weaknesses. The problem almost always ends up being, however, that the players that do this, aka the MiG-23 players that fly high and avoid close combat for most of the game, almost always fly alone and are typically the only plane or planes left at the end of a match, with numerous hungry enemies starting to chase them. I've seen this numerous times personally. At this point, unless you've conserved your fuel or have already refueled, there's a good chance that you'll need to come back down in altitude anyways, which puts you at a major disadvantage. Not only are you forced to come out of your element high in the sky, but you need to make yourself vulnerable by landing at base and sitting for a relatively long period of time while you refuel and rearm. Again, this is not to say that the MiG-23 is not one of the best planes in game. Same with the MiG-27. I think they are probably the best planes currently in War Thunder for quite a few scenarios, like high altitude engagements and intercepting. Again, as stated numerous times, these are not common scenarios, as fights almost always devolve to being lower altitudes, regardless of BR. The trick to being good with the MiG-23 or MiG-27 is to have your enemies come to your domain rather than you going down to theirs. Unfortunately, unless a large large portion of your team is comprised of either the MiG-23 or MiG-27, and unless you're well coordinated, this will probably never happen. And even if it did, you will likely be shot down by radar-guided missiles sooner or later, especially now that the JA-37C Viggen has been introduced. In a way, I think that a lot of people expected the MiG-23 to be like how the Viggen is. Of course, this isn't accurate, and a ton of people probably didn't think that the MiG would be so unmaneuverable at least lowish altitudes. Even though personally I find it to be somewhat maneuverable, a lot of people just don't. It's funny because a ton of people thought that the MiG-23 was going to be this ridiculously OP plane when it was first released, when Red Skies was coming out, and really across most altitudes and speeds, because they saw it and they're like, this is a variable sweep aircraft, this is gonna have advanced missiles, it's gonna be able to do this, that, and the other thing. And they weren't really privy to how this plane functions in real life. And of course, this is a game, it's not real life, but in kind of almost a mirroring scenario, right? It's not really all too far from real life. It doesn't really function nearly as advertised in War Thunder as people thought it would. And in that way, it's a little bit funny. And you can kind of see this expectation that it was going to be OP in the dev blog for the MiG-23. There are people out there that think, or that thought, that this would be a ridiculously OP plane. Now, insofar as how the MiG-23, and to a point the MiG-27, but more so obviously the MiG-23, how it performed in real life, I've got kind of a little bit of a quote here, and this is more or less a paraphrase, and I'm adapting it from something a Discord member said. Admiral Hip, if you are there, listening, watching, thank you for this. But basically, it goes, the MiG-23 is a pig, it's blind, and all it can do is go fast. Now, in real life, US Air Force pilots that were able to fly captured MiG-23s called it the looping hog, because a high loop was one of the only basic combat maneuvers that the MiG-23 could perform. If flying fast enough, the MiG-23 could perform a 4-mile long loop faster and more adeptly than most other contemporary planes, and be out of visual range by the time that the plane that was chasing it would actually be able to finish its own loop. Unfortunately though, as in real life, the MiG-23 looks good, but wasn't really as good as it was, at least showing in practice. Now in real life combat, the MiG-23 was, and still is, a relatively undesirable plane, with many countries phasing them out of service before they even phased out the MiG-21 and other late variants of the MiG-21. In fact, some countries still use the MiG-21 that no longer use the MiG-23, partially because of cost, but also partially because the MiG-23 again looked good on paper, but was a failure in combat. In fact, according to MiGflug.com, link below, it has a total of 25 wins in air combat versus 102 total defeats, again in air-to-air combat. This could be attributed to many things like unskilled pilots or poor maintenance, both leading to underperforming MiG-23s, but it still stands that it is less than a 0.25 kill ratio versus enemy planes, whereas a plane like the F-15 is currently 102-0, at least when it comes to versing enemy aircraft. Even the MiG-21, in all of its variants and its incredibly long combat history in various circumstances with variously skilled pilots, and trust me, there have been some really unskilled pilots of the MiG-21, even that has almost a 0.5 win to loss ratio, with 240 kills to 501 losses to enemy aircraft, again according to MiGflug.com. This data is as of 2015, again per MiGflug. Despite this, it is one of the most heavily produced variable sweep aircraft of all time. Actually, it is the most heavily produced variable sweep combat aircraft of all time, with over 5,000 examples of all variants being built. Now, this all said, back to how the MiG-23 and MiG-27 relate to War Thunder. Now, as stated, I don't think that they're bad planes. It's that many people just don't know how to properly fly them, that many of the most common combat air scenarios for War Thunder are where the MiG-23 and 27 perform worst in comparison to their enemies, and it's that the MiG-23 and MiG-27 are in War Thunder in a time that is possibly too early for them. One could argue that enemy planes with similar roles and characteristics against the MiG-23 or compared to the MiG-23 and 27 would be a better fit to fight them. But at that point, what's stopping someone who's skilled from getting into a trusty F-5E and just dominating them, and by bringing them into low altitude combat, as we see happening pretty often currently, even months after the release of both planes? It's difficult to say. Of course, the way forward for planes in War Thunder is by moving more into the future, but at this point, we're beginning to see the disparity in aircraft design and performance between the West and the Soviet Union. Most Soviet planes beyond 1960, or at least beyond the the 1960s as a decade were not at all comparable to their contemporary American planes in terms of performance and capabilities, whereas there was at least some degree of parity beforehand. We may be seeing something like how bombers are in War Thunder as well, with bombers seeming like a good idea as they were very effective in real life, but in game are just largely ineffective as there aren't enough adequate defensive systems in place to defend them, either being escorts, electronic warfare of some kind, or simply being in a huge combat box of other bombers that could help to defend each other. Possibly the style of combat that planes like the MiG-23 and MiG-27 bring to War Thunder simply does not jive with the game, and in the future, fast, maneuverable light fighters like the F-16, F-5E, MiG-29, etc. will dominate, as opposed to things like the MiG-25, MiG-31, A-10 partially being that so slow, the Frogfoot, or even the long-awaited F-14, being that it won't be as maneuverable as many of the smaller fighters that will eventually come to War Thunder, although it would be interesting to see it fight the Su-27. We may be seeing the Russian air tech tree receive planes that are substantially newer in terms of age to compete with relatively older Western designs, such as the Su-27 compared to the F-16, being that the Su-27 was introduced nearly a decade after the F-16, or the MiG-29 versus the F-16, although the MiG-29, to be fair, was introduced in 1982 to their military compared to the F-16 being introduced into service in 1978, so only 4 years of difference. This, however, might not matter as the F-16 was arguably more advanced and is substantially lighter than the MiG-29. Heck, it's even about half the weight of the Su-27, possibly leading to another F-5E to MiG-23 scenario, but maybe not as bad if you're looking at the MiG-29 versus the F-16. And one interesting thing to point out here is that with the MiG-27, because this is the first plane that's actually encountering this problem, and really all future aircraft that have this same sort of technology, is that when it comes to laser-guided ordnance, it puts a major handicap on the player using it, because you have to fly slow, you have to fly in a relatively predictable flight path in order for the smart weapon to actually hit the ground. So you can't overshoot, you can't do a lot of things that you would otherwise do to be able to avoid SPAA, enemy aircraft, whatever the case may be, because you want your smart bomb to hit where it's supposed to. Now, a lot of the time, by the time the smart bomb actually hits the ground, the target's moved or whatever the case may be. So in my opinion, I'd rather use dumb bombs with a ballistics computer from 2,000 meters rather than a smart bomb from 4,000 meters up and try to hit the target from there, because at the end of the day, you have to fly predictably and slowly, which puts you at a huge risk. So really, I just personally, that's another thing, I don't really see how that's going to jive with War Thunder's mechanics in game and how people actually play it. Either way, the plight of the MiG-23 and MiG-27 is telling for the future of War Thunder, and as disparities grow between aircraft that countries have, we may end up seeing some countries receiving noticeably more aircraft than others in an attempt to close the gap artificially. Either that, or we may see artificial buffs or nerfs to try to even the playing field. We also might see some sort of specialized game modes where aircraft are matched based on type rather than BR. For example, the F-16 could fight the MiG-29, whereas the F-14 could face the Su-27, MiG-23, MiG-27, etc. Although the F-14 is heavier than all of those and had different capabilities in mind when it was planned compared to most or all Soviet planes, being that the F-14 was at least initially thought of as a fleet defense fighter. So really, either way, I think that's all very interesting and is possibly the first major sign of a far different War Thunder than I think most people imagine, whether it's for the better or for the worse, at least in the somewhat distant future, probably 2023 and beyond. So who knows? I think that this is a huge preface to beyond visual range combat, and it will change everything for War Thunder and really favor planes that right now might stink, but could be really good in the future. So that all said, thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, and especially subscribe if you would like more content. Tell me what you thought in the comments below, of course, what you thought about this. Again, I don't think that the MiG-23 or MiG-27 are bad planes. I think that they're really, really good, and I have a ton of fun with them. Actually, I'm more successful with them a lot of the time than when I'm in my F5E. But again, it's just kind of the type of gameplay that most people subscribe to, and it just doesn't jive with them. But again, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I will see you all on the other side. Take care, everyone.